God, as Aaron said earlier. There's no doubt
the similarities
that
between Calvinism, hyper Calvinism and Islam, Usama has shown us the massive similarities. Quick comment, Aaron, about Turkey before we run out of time. The music's playing. Sorry, go ahead though.
Well, no, I just agree with Shaham that they are the seat of power now, and we need to look out for them. And be watchmen on the wall and alert and pray and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, the Lord said, and make sure that the leaven that we're eating is the pure, right word of God, not
Amen.
Watered down at all.
Sharam and Aaron, thank you guys. Thank you, folks. Take care.
Colonel Rob Maness has a lifelong record of providing dedicated service to this nation. Having worked his way up from the enlisted ranks to full colonel, he served our country for more than 32 years. He has served as a bomber squadron commander, bomb disposal technician, Joint Chiefs of Staff Operations Officer, assisted the National Security Team with the campaign plan for the global war on terrorism. He authored the first theater nuclear war plan, and served as the Vice Commander of America's largest airborne intelligence wing. Colonel Rob Maness is a true American hero. This is Rob Maness Live.
Senator, as someone who enlisted in the military specifically because of Al-Qaeda's terrorist attack on 9/11 and committing myself and my life to doing what I could to defeat these terrorists, it was shocking and a betrayal to me and every person who was killed on 9/11, their families and my brothers and sisters in uniform. When, as a member of Congress, I learned about President Obama's dual programs that he had begun really to overthrow the regime of Syria, and being willing to, through the CIA's Timber Sycamore program that has now been made public, of working with and arming and equipping Al-Qaeda in an effort to overthrow that regime, starting yet another regime change war in the Middle East. DoD Train and Equip program, again, begun under President Obama, is widely been known, looked at, and studied, that ultimately resulted in over $500 million being used to train who they called moderate rebels, but were actually fighters working with and aligned with Al-Qaeda's affiliate on the ground in Syria, all to move forward with their regime change and not acknowledging what was obvious at the time and what has unfortunately borne true, which was that a regime change war in Syria, much like the regime change wars in Iraq, the toppling of Gaddafi and Mubarak, while these are all dictators, would likely result in the rise of Islamist extremists like Al-Qaeda taking power. I shed no tears for the fall of the Assad regime, but today we have an Islamist extremist who is now in charge of Syria, as I said, who danced on the streets to celebrate the 9/11 attack, who ruled over Idlib with an Islamist extremist governance, and who has already begun to persecute and kill and arrest religious minorities like Christians in Syria.
I understand.
Why that should be acceptable to anyone is beyond me.
It shouldn't
is
be.
certainly
and
not in our
interests.
It's not acceptable. Syrian government Islamists are massacring Christians and Alawites and Druze and all kinds of other ethnic minorities in the country now. Is that a harbinger for America? Well, welcome back to More War Monday. The Rob Maness Show is live on World YouTube, our X Spaces simulcast. We're also on Rumble, YouTube, Truth Social Plus, Amazon, and Roku. Well, they called Tulsi Gabbard a Russian asset for speaking out against Syria's interim government. It only took less than a month for what she said to come true and become a reality. What's really happening there? The geostrategic situation is complex and it involves the United States, Russia, Israel, Turkey, Iran, China, and many more. Overlaying what we're seeing there onto the United States internally, considering the tens of thousands of potential Islamist terrorists that have been let in through our open southern border, gives me great pause, folks. Based on what I'm seeing, we're at very high risk of a significant homeland attack by Islamists that will exceed 9/11 and likely exceed what the October 7th attacks in Israel looked like exponentially. All Americans should be at an elevated state of alertness, in my opinion. My guest today is the man that wrote that book, If It Takes 1,000 Years. Former Army Captain Jesse Petria has traveled worldwide on fact-finding missions. He's researched the mindset of the jihadists and the policies that enable them. He's served as a civilian advisor to the U.S. Department of State and was a liaison officer in the Army to the Afghan secret police, facilitating the interrogations of over 400 captured Taliban and al-Qaeda members. That's why you should read that book, If It Takes 1,000 Years. That's where the information came from. Jesse, welcome back to the Rob Maness Show.
Thank you, Colonel Maness. I appreciate it. Great to be back.
It's good to see you. I wish it was under better circumstances, though. I had no idea that, sorry about that audio. I had no idea when I asked you to come on a few weeks ago that this was going to be happening and this timing of what we're seeing happen in Syria the last 4 days or so. But
well, unfortunately, it's only going to continue given what we witnessed for the last 4 years of us not only supplying and aiding the jihadists around the world, but opening our southern border and allowing millions of people through, and no doubt thousands of which are jihadists who are just laying in wait, plotting the next attack.
Yeah, you've been studying this for a long, long time, and not just with tunnel vision either, from a broad geostrategic political perspective, Jesse. And I just wanted to ask you this question before we dive too deep into the strategy and tactics of what we need to be thinking about. And that is, why was Ms. Gabbard right and so many in power? I mean, there's guys like you and me, folks like Sarah Adams, the former CIA analyst and targeter, that speaks out on this, but so many people in power in elected office, appointed office in the civil service, either won't acknowledge it, deny it, or just aren't seeing what we can all see. And Gabbard's really the first person that I know to be able to talk straight about it that's in a high office now. Why is that? What do you think about what's going on?
Well, personally, I think it's because we have nothing at stake as far as other than our lives and our way of life. Whereas a lot of the bureaucrats and elected officials over the past several decades for several administrations, both Democrat and Republican alike, prior to this administration, we have seen a military-industrial complex that had its tentacles in everything. I mean, you can look at going back to the George Bush administration. Who was the vice president? Vice President Cheney, who was the former CEO of Halliburton, and who got the largest or one of the largest defense contracts in Iraq? Halliburton. So there's things like that that I think are very real. Eisenhower absolutely was right when he said the military-industrial complex was real. I saw it firsthand when I was there, and unfortunately, when we're fighting these endless wars that are very short-sighted, such as what we did in Syria, we're supporting defense contractors over American interests and also over common sense. It's as if we never learn our lesson, and that's the crazy thing. We've done this so many times, going back to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, where we send weapons and other support to people who would gladly see us hanging at the end of a rope, and who are very clear in stating that they desire us and the rest of the world to be under a global Islamic caliphate. And yet we decide, oh yeah, we're going to send this guy because he's less of a terrorist. But in reality, if you look at all of the regimes that we have undermined in recent decades, whether it's as Tulsi Gabbard mentioned, a few of them, whether it's Assad, whether it's in Libya, whether it's the Mubarak's regime in Egypt. You have all of these terrible secular dictators that were brutalizing and oppressing their own people, but they were secular. and they were keeping the lid on a pot. And it might not be palatable for the Western mind, but when we take that lid off of the pot and we witness what happened a few days ago in Syria, where you see this sectarian violence now starting to rear its ugly head in those countries, it's very evident that these dictators, as brutal as they were able to force people to get along, where they I think there's no better evidence than if you look at Kemal Ataturk in the history of Turkey, where you see you have a very backward society up to that point, and he was able to just force them into the Western world. You can see it again in other places, even in Saudi Arabia. I would venture to say you have leadership who is very Western, that's keeping the lid on a very dangerous pot of tribal sectarian jihadists. And they're able to maintain order. And why would we want to muck that up? And whenever we do, you can see the results very clearly before our eyes. And they're tragic, but unfortunately, they're altogether predictable.
Yeah. And, the interesting thing, less than 2 hours ago, I was in a meeting with a group of Republicans, and one of them is a friend of mine. He's a sitting pastor in a local church here. And I asked him if he had heard about this, because it's on my mind. I've been studying it, getting ready for the show and everything. And he shocked me. He said, "No, I haven't heard of it." That led me to the next question I wrote down for you is, how can we get the legacy media to do the right thing and report facts on something like this? I mean, this is because they're not really. I mean, it's us. It's people like you and me and our colleagues in the independent space here that are talking about it openly. That's a disservice to the rest of the people in the world, isn't it, that they won't report on it?
Well, I think their power is really starting to wane. I realized this pretty early on when I was kicking and screaming about it 25 years ago, almost. But there's certain things that we can do to demand attention. I think, thankfully, it is getting the attention, and we have tools, resources such as X, which didn't exist in previous years. But unfortunately, the narrative still is very largely driven by mainstream media. But it's up to us to kick and scream. I remember I wanted to bring attention to this issue in 2006. There was, if you recall, the Mohammed cartoon riots that were going on. And you would see on the television this grossly slanted version of it, where I remember one of them, it said, they kept saying, disenfranchised youths are rioting. Youths, these pesky youths. And it wouldn't label the youths as jihadists. But what's interesting, I started digging into it. There was a King Al-Walid bin Talal at the time was very much trying to influence the news. And he bragged about it in a meeting that he bought so many shares of News Corp that he had a direct line to the leadership of the company. And he calls up Rupert Murdoch after he saw that they had mentioned that they were Islamist riots, and he bragged that he got them to change the names to youths. And so he was trying to take credit for that. But I held an event that I talk about in the book. This is why activism is so important. We're at UC Irvine. This is gosh, almost 20 years ago. 20 years ago next year. We held an event called the Unveiling of the Cartoons. And so what we did, the goal was to draw out the jihadists, and what we did is we put anti-Semitic, anti-Western cartoons on one side and the Mohammed cartoons on another. And the anti-Semitic, anti-Western cartoons were from Middle East newspapers. We put a Muslim, a Jew, and a Christian on the panel, and we had an open discussion on the root causes of the riots. Well, we had about 2,000 screaming jihadists outside, some of whom were actually waving cardboard AK-47s. So it was such a great splash in the media and a great event to draw awareness to it. MSNBC reported on it. CNN broadcast live from the event. It was so big that they couldn't ignore it. And I remember a little old lady coming up to me afterwards. I moderated the event. And she said, I had no idea that they were here. And there they are. And it's like, that's it. And this was 20 years ago. And unfortunately, their numbers have only grown. They've become emboldened by foreign adversaries. And now what was unthinkable then, we have Western college students rioting in favor of them, protesting in favor of the jihadists on our campuses. And I think that's the real threat. It goes beyond what these kinetic terrorist attacks that are being plotted, and they're trying to get to our kids. I mean, we're like frogs being boiled in a pot, and I think that's far more dangerous than actual physical terrorism.
Yeah, and we got to take a break, Jesse. But when we come back, folks, I'm going to show you a clip. It's very nasty. Don't avert your eyes, though. You need to watch this in its full extent, because what Jesse's describing with the students being affected by these terrorists, this is what they turn into. You'll see them in this clip. And yes, it is very harsh, but you're going to watch it because you've got to know what these people do. We'll be right back on the Rob Maness Show.
Hello, I'm Brandon House. I want to thank you for all your support at wvwfoundation.com that helps make possible pushing out 24/7 content for free. Without your support, we'd have to put it all behind a paywall. But thanks to you and your support through our foundation, we're able to push it out for free as a broadcast service and broadcast ministry of WVW Foundation. Please consider going there and setting up an automatic monthly contribution, or go there and make an occasional contribution. If you prefer to support us through the mail, you'll find our mailing address there at wvwfoundation.com. You can also call and make your contribution over the phone by calling 901-825-0652. That's 901-825-0652. Again, all these details are available at wvwfoundation.com. Thank you for your support as we try to help people around the world understand the times through the lens of a Christian worldview.
قربت ليكي العالم كله مش عليكي ما كنا نعمل غير هيك
Welcome back to the Rob Maness Show. It's More War Monday, and that's raw video right there. It's uncut, unblurred. You have to look at it because this is what is in store if we do not make sure that we protect ourselves. And that's just over this last weekend. And they're killing civilians. They're dragging Christians and Alawites and all kinds of other ethnic minorities out of their houses. Making them crawl in the streets and shooting them in the back of the head. That's just one small video cut. And my guest today is the author of If It Takes 1,000 Years, former U.S. Army officer, Jesse Petria. Jesse, we have to show these. We can't let people deny it in themselves. You know, like I told my pastor friend this morning, I said, you got to go look at this. I sent him a copy of the clip because people need to know what these animals are really capable of doing. I don't know why we lose that culturally in our society, because we know it. We've gone through 25 years of war against them, the attacks on 9/11, and even before that and after. So, but who? There are a lot of groups involved in this in Syria. Before we turn to the United States, give us a bit of a perspective. The government, it's run by a group called HTS. And the head of it's a man named Al-Jilani, who looks and talks very Western now, wears suits and ties and all that. But he hasn't always been that way, has he?
Well, Dennis Prager has said it, that these are the monsters of our time. And that was the blurb that he actually, in the blurb for my book, he wrote about how evil these people are. You know, I tell my kids that monsters aren't real, but there are real monsters out there, and this is them. And unfortunately, the leader of Al-Qaeda, the former leader of Al-Qaeda and the former leader of ISIS, is that monster that you mentioned named Jilani. And he is now the president of the de facto leader of Syria. And it's just such a fallacy for us to believe that just because he trims his beard and puts on a suit and can talk a good talk, that somehow he is different or has changed. I mean, he says, trust me, I've changed. And it's I'll tell you that interacting with the jihadists in Afghanistan, some of the leaders of Al-Qaeda, which were some of the most friendly, warmest seeming people I've ever met, as well as the leadership of Al-Qaeda, or the Taliban rather, the Taliban commanders, they were all very warm, friendly, and you wouldn't know it until you read their records and when you get to know what they've done and who they are and what they believe in, just how truly deceptive they are. It's another level of sinisterness. This is something that goes far beyond any kind of criminal element. This is true evil. It's absolute evil. And what the American people need to understand is that it's really, it's not on a personal level. So these people will be smiling at you, and meanwhile, they'll be plotting the destruction of your entire way of life. And they don't want you dead. They don't want me dead. They want all of us to submit or die. The jihadists only carve the world into two different categories. There's Dar al-Islam, which is the land of Islam that's subdued under Sharia law, and there's Dar al-Harb, which is the land of war. And that's it. There's one or the other. They will not make any exception for anything in between. And for us to think that they will, that somehow if the liberals only ally with them, that they'll get a free pass somehow if, God forbid, the jihadists ever did establish their global caliphate, it's magical, ludicrous thinking, and that's what I would like to convey across to our friends on the left, is that, look, we can, on this issue, we can either hang together or we can hang separately if, God forbid, these people ever win.
Yeah, and they literally are going to do that. If they don't shoot you in the back of the head or cut your throat, cut your head off, they'll hang you. And they'll literally do that. And they do hang people together, and they hang them separately. I just saw a photograph this morning from Syria where they hung a man. It just, what really makes me angry, though, is the United States of America is heavily involved in resourcing, training, giving food, ammunition, arms to this group. Yeah, we also are involved in helping our Kurdish friends in that part of the world too. But to tie ourselves to these guys, the Kurds aren't going to go out and do this kind of stuff. The Druze down in the south aren't going to go out and do this kind of stuff. The Christians certainly don't go out and do this kind of stuff, not in this century anyway, and then to allow ourselves to go along with our allies, the Turks, to support HTS and all the different factions that align with them. And by the way, I should mention this too. They have a large complement of foreign fighters that have come from all over Chechnya, Afghanistan, Iran, Pakistan, that are Islamist type, Saudi Arabia, even Lebanon, Gaza, and those kind of places. So why is the United States so willing to do this?
I think it's a mix of ignorance and also downright wicked greed for the defense contractors. I firmly believe that a lot of our foreign policy has been pushed and dictated and narrated by these defense contractors. It's just, and you can see it in Ukraine, you can see it in Iraq, you saw it in Afghanistan. I mean, these are to have these endless perpetual wars are great for these companies. And I think it's just such a short-sighted view. Also, the big problem is that we want to see results quickly, and we as Americans in general and as politicians, they look at how much that they can do not too far beyond the horizon, without realizing that our enemies are taking a much more long-term approach. That's the name of my book, If It Takes 1,000 Years. And those were the words that were told to me by a Taliban commander about how long they intend to fight us. And so when we're thinking 2 or 4 years at a time, which is just to the next re-election, there's not much you can do on this issue in that time. And so all it's going to do is keep kicking the can down the road, and they're just going to do a little smoke and mirrors for a couple years and make it look like we're doing something. And unfortunately, that just continues. I see a significant improvement under the current administration, but there's a lot still going on that is very short-sighted. I think we need to take a much more long-term approach to this. There was a common phrase that the jihadists used to say in Afghanistan. I heard it a number of times, where they used to say, "You have the watches, but we have the time." And it's such a creepy phrase that just sums it up. That it's like, I mean, we're here fighting yesterday's war and just making things look pretty when these guys are just looking generationally 1,000 years in the future. And unfortunately, when it comes to the home front, it comes back to snap at us real bad. If our kids are being indoctrinated and our voters are being changed to support these scumbags, which is what they're doing, they're master propagandists, then we're in for a whole lot of hurt in the future.
We sure are. Well, let's take a question from our live audience. We got a hand up over there. Shell is our host. Go ahead, Shell.
We have cookies, sir.
Good afternoon. A question I had is, could you maybe discuss or talk about maybe some of the differences between Trump's first term, Biden's term, and now? I know he hasn't been in there very long. And also, how badly did our Afghan withdrawal hurt us in these folks' eyes?
The question being the differences between the various terms of the presidencies between Trump 1, Biden, and now, and also the damage of our Afghanistan withdrawal. I think the difference between that would be right now we've got some of the right people, I think, in charge. Number one, that we're talking in President Trump's current administration. I think the biggest mistake that he had in term 1 was that he was trusting the generals a little bit too much. He was trusting political hacks that had been in the system for very long. You had people like General Milley. You had a number of other generals that were just completely co-opted by the system. If you think about it, in order to become a general, and I'm sure Colonel Maness, you saw it at the colonel level, you started to see how political it gets. And if you wanted to put on a star, you got to kiss some butt. You got to be politically correct. You got to say all the right things, because these are senatorial appointments, and they're very political. And unfortunately, in order to get to that level as well, you have to have you have to have senior level or high level education. And we all know what the Ivy League universities are producing for the last 20 years. It's been a bunch of indoctrination. These folks that are at the top right now are going to take it's going to take a lot of attrition to fix it, because we have a whole lot of generals that are just completely clueless and disconnected from what the reality is on the ground. But the ground level fighters, the people actually understood in Afghanistan, I think, what we were facing and what was going to happen. I think the collapse, and that's why it was so despicable that it collapsed in our face so quickly and rapidly and embarrassingly the way that it did under President Biden, because it was so predictable. I'll tell you, there was a task that I was given when I was there to turn over a bunch of weapons to the Afghan authorities, which I thought was ridiculous. It was a full Connex shipping container that was filled with captured AK-47s, RPGs, different weapons that were taken from the Taliban and Al-Qaeda members that we captured. They'd just been throwing them in a shipping container, and so they didn't really know what to do with them. So the colonel had the bright idea, said, let's give them to the Afghans for some favors. And I shook my head, and I told the major that was in charge. It was me, another officer, and the major was in charge. We just had to take the ammunition away from it, separate the bolts, kind of make them not just a massacre waiting to happen in a box right there in the middle of Bagram. But when I was doing that, I was like, sir, you know that these are going all right to the Taliban as soon as we get out of here, right? And this was in 2012. Immediately in the room, everybody said, yeah, we know. Yeah, definitely. We all know these are going to the Taliban. It's inevitable. And so everybody on the ground knew it was fake. It was smoke and mirrors. A lot of going back to the military-industrial complex, a lot of these contracts that we were protecting there were just absolutely egregious. There was a husband and wife team that was walking around the post, and it was a running joke about what they do. Nobody could figure out what they do. Each of them, they were employees of a company by the name of Fluor, who had the biggest contract right there at the time. Each of them was making about $250,000 a year tax-free. And so they were either at the dining facility, eating, going for a stroll, or watching a movie. It was one of those three things. And you amplify that by tens of thousands of contractors who were doing essentially the same thing. It was all just spending money. There was a facility that I was liaisoning to. I was liaison to the. It was called the NDS, which was the Afghan secret police, and they were doing the prosecutions of the captured Taliban and Al-Qaeda members, mostly Taliban. But they set up a courthouse that we paid for. It was about $14 million. I saw the documents that we paid to build this courthouse. It ended up being a bunch of rebars that were sticking up out of the mud that somebody eventually came and stole to recycle, by the way, while I was there. But it was completely fake. We spent the money. Then it was all smoke and mirrors. There was a housing facility that we built while I was there. They went to turn on the power, and all the wires melted. Smoke started coming out, and they found out we scraped out the wire. It was aluminum. They were counterfeit wires. It was all just totally fake smoke and mirrors, spending millions, billions of dollars on this thing. But I mean, I'm not diminishing what our war fighters did. We as Americans killed an awful lot of bad guys while we were there. And we did keep the home front safe because they were tied up over there for 20 years. So I don't diminish that. But at the same time, it could have been handled so differently. The idea that we were going to give them a Western Democratic Republican style government was just ludicrous. I remember one guy was brought in, a Taliban fighter, and the interrogator stopped him in the middle of the interrogation, and or rather the fighter stopped the interrogator in the middle of it and said, what is that stick in your hand? He had never seen a pen before in his life. And these are the types of people that we were trying to teach our style of government to. It was bound to fail. It was bound to collapse. And it was an absolute embarrassment the way that it happened, because it was so inevitable.
Absolutely. It caused a lot of long-term damage. When we come back from this break, we'll hear from Tulsi Gabbard again. Now she's the DNI from just last week at the southern border, and that's a big part of the damage that withdrawal from Afghanistan caused. And we'll talk about that as we turn to the homeland with Jesse Patria, author of If It Takes 1,000 Years. These jihadists will take as long as they need to destroy us. We'll be right back on More War Monday.
For your leadership and bringing the country's attention to what has been happening here at the border and the significant change that has already occurred under the short time that President Trump has been in office. Really what you're seeing here today and what you'll continue to see is a unified effort across President Trump's national security team, the Department of Homeland Security, towards our mission, which is to ensure a safe, free, and prosperous society for Americans. As Director of National Intelligence, there are a number of areas where we are focused. The President talked about in his speech, over 21 million people have come across our borders illegally under Joe Biden's administration. There are many of them that we don't know who they are. They have not been vetted. We don't know where they are. I'll give you one quick example of one of the problems that we are getting after. From Central Asia, there were over 4,000 people who came across our borders using an ISIS-affiliated network. Our National Counterterrorism Center went through and identified those individuals. There were hundreds of them who were either known terrorists or associated with known terrorists. That information was provided to the Biden administration. You may remember in some of the news, a little over 100 of those people were arrested in 2024. Of those who were arrested, only 8 were either deported or remained in custody. Only 8. The rest of them were released back into our country. Where are they? What are they doing? What may they be plotting? This is just the beginning. There are many, many areas that we need to stay very focused on, working with the Department of Homeland Security, working with the FBI to ensure that we're keeping the American people safe. Our Counterterrorism Center is working on making sure that we have that single source for vetting so that we can figure out who is actually in our country and identify those who pose a threat and get them removed. The President's designation of the cartels as foreign terrorist organizations falls directly into this, especially as we're seeing some of the tactics that these cartels are using reflect some of the tactics that we've seen used by Islamist terrorists in countries that many of us have served in overseas. Our mission is very clear. Our objective is to keep the American people safe. I'm grateful to be a part of this team that President Trump has assembled to accomplish that mission. Thank you.
Welcome back to the Rob Maness Show. We are live here at Worldview Tube and our X Spaces simulcast. And just a note for our X Spaces listeners, X is under a full-on cyber attack. Elon Musk has tweeted about it and thinks it's from a very large corporation or some kind of nation-state attack. I've been observing it all morning long. It looks like it's big enough to where I would probably categorize it. It's probably a nation-state attack of some sort. So if you lose us, you can go over to Rumble and watch the show live. And you can catch us on Facebook, too, on Getter. And I think the live feed for Twitter is down today because of what's going on. So my guest today is Jesse Petria, the author of If It Takes 1,000 Years. He's an Afghanistan veteran. He's a qualified, not even a qualified, just an expert in the Taliban, and more importantly, in the Islamists. And Jesse, that clip from Gabbard was just last week when she and Vice President Vance and Secretary Hegseth were down at the border. I think we've got some good news after 4 long years of untold thousands of Islamists coming through that border. I'm not buying that it's 4,000 or 5,000. I think it's well into the tens of thousands, and we have no idea where they're at. And that in and of itself is a great danger to the American people, isn't it?
And unfortunately, it only took 19 to carry out 9/11. We shouldn't forget that. And it's not just illegal immigrants, too. There have been cases of vetted Afghans and other immigrants that came in through legal means, such as that of Nasir Tawhidi, who was a ISIS-affiliated jihadist who was arrested for plotting an election day massacre. He purchased, along with another, which was a juvenile, actually, jihadist. Both of them purchased AK-47s and about 500 rounds of ammunition, and they were days away from carrying out this attack when they were arrested. And so this was just a few months ago. And that was an Afghan that was vetted. He was let through. He was let in after the fall of Afghanistan. That's his appreciation for us letting him in. And it just goes to show they don't care. The jihadists are coming in here. They're hell bent on this goal of destroying the West. And you can give them everything you want and everything they want, rather, and they'll just look at it as, oh, look, the infidels are being used by Allah for giving us all this stuff. They won't appreciate it, and it's really tragic because we don't know who the good guys are and who the bad guys are. I mean, I don't make any. I certainly do recognize the fact that the biggest victims of Islamic terror are Muslims. They are killing their own people. Anyone, as you mentioned, the slaughter that's going on in Syria, anyone who doesn't fit their narrow jihadist worldview is going to be slaughtered, and that includes secular Muslims as well. The moment you deviate from their fundamentalist worldview, they'll brand you as an apostate and say, that's it, death to you. But to be honest, I think the fact that all the jihadists are, I mean, it's tragic for the average Muslims, but the jihadist groups fighting amongst one another is actually our saving grace. If they were to ever find a Maness raider who unites all the clans and it actually gets them together, we would be in a world of trouble. But you've got Al-Qaeda fighting ISIS, you've got the Taliban fighting Al-Qaeda, you've got all these different groups, although nowadays they're friends again, Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. But you've got all these groups that they're fighting, they're friends, then they're fighting, and it's just all this mishmash of everyone fighting one another. They are not united by any stretch of the word, but they are united in one goal, and that's their hatred of the West. Their desire to establish this global Islamist world government under Sharia law. And what's creepy is that we have Western lunatics who welcome it. You can see what's going on in Europe, where you had the Archbishop of Canterbury at one point said, Sharia law is inevitable. Let's give them Sharia. Why don't we want to fight against it? And stuff like that, where you have in Canada, 2004, the Canadian government recognized Sharia courts for civil matters. Did you know that?
Yeah.
It's outrageous.
I did.
And so that's the thing, is they don't know what this is. They don't know how brutal Sharia law is, how oppressive it is to women, how just what it is. And it's just another culture. It's just something else. And that's why we need to educate ourselves, especially the elected officials. I would challenge everybody listening. Try to meet with an elected official, low level. Specifically school board. Go take them to coffee. Talk to them about this issue, because those are the future members of Congress. Those are the future senators, the future presidents. A lot of them served at that level. Not only that, the school board members have so much more influence. If you think about it, they have tens of thousands of kids going before their schools. And those are the voters of tomorrow. there's only about a little over 500 federal elected officials, but there's over 500,000 local officials, and they're very approachable. So we've got to educate them on this issue, and we've got to focus also on our kids and educate them on this issue because they're the voters. And so as long as people continue to remain naive about who these people are, you'll have bureaucrats in the Beltway who will be feeding the jihadists throughout the world. And if there's nobody there to give them an inch, they won't be able to gain any ground.
Yeah, and that's it. We can't give them an inch, but we have very naive people with power in this country that need to be educated on this issue. We got to take our last break, Jesse. When we come back, we'll hear from former CIA analyst and targeter Sarah Adams a little bit about what she thinks may be going to happen here in the country. But I want to talk about where will they get a lot of their force from, and I think it'll be from the student population at our universities. And we'll get Jesse's take on that. We'll be right back with Jesse Petria on More War Monday on Worldview Tube.
of your X account recently, and I want to read one of your recent posts because I think it really encompasses a lot that's going on that people might not be fully aware of. On your X, you posted, both Al-Qaeda and ISIS are fully operational Afghanistan-Pakistan border region and pose a greater threat now than at any time in the last 20 years. The idea that the ISIS fight is primarily inside Syria is outdated. Most of ISIS's senior leadership relocated to Afghanistan and Pakistan 3 years ago. Meanwhile, the U.S. is funding a fake ISIS fight in Syria through the DoD while also pretending there's a joint counter-ISKP effort with the Taliban. It's time for honesty. Our current strategy ignores the real threat. So with that in mind, I just want to start with one simple question. Are Americans today secure?
Well, I mean, Americans aren't secure. The main reason is obviously because of the open border policy, right? And a lot of nefarious actors came in, not just terrorists. So we are at our least secure point since 9/11, in my opinion.
Okay, then let me back that up a little bit and make it more specific. Since January 20th and the inauguration of Donald Trump, do you feel that Americans are more secure or less secure, especially when you consider his cabinet picks like Hegseth at the DoD or Rubio at State, Ratcliffe for the CIA? Are these decisions that are going to put Americans in a better position in your belief, or are we backsliding?
I think we're going to be in a better position because I think they're being a little more honest about the threats. But as you can imagine, when you ignore something for 4 years, it's festered and now it's a much bigger problem. So they can't fix everything quick enough.
Welcome back to the Rob Maness Show. It's More War Monday, and we're talking about the Islamists, what their actions are, like in places over in Syria where they're massacring minority groups like Christians and Alawites. We're talking about the impact of the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan and what impact that is having, not just around the world, but specifically inside the United States. And my guest today is Jesse Petria, author of If It Takes 1,000 Years. It's about the Islamists, that book is, and how they know and they acknowledge and they let us know time is on their side. And they're absolutely right. And now with all of this infiltration, Jesse, of who God knows how many numbers of Islamists, and not just that, but Sarah made a good point there. The other nefarious characters that may or may not be supporters of the Islamists or become supporters of the Islamists too, that have come in, like the 100,000 plus Chinese military age males. And we know there's a Red-Green alliance that's been going on for a long time. So Jesse, I guess I'll just lead this off with, we have to face the real threat. I think it's inside the country too. The indicators are real. The conditions are right. And like my pastor friend who wasn't aware of what was happening in Syria, I think most people just aren't aware of what's going on. That's
just it. And unfortunately, they're not aware until it's too late. And I think it's important to recognize the fact that there are two types of jihad. There's the kinetic jihad, as I call it, which is actual physical terrorist attacks. And as troubling and as stressful as that is, I think the other type of jihad that I call stealth jihad is far more dangerous because you don't realize that you're under attack until it's too late. And that's where a jihadist will come in, they'll shave their beard, they'll put on a suit, and they'll start suing people to shut them up. Or they'll start pushing for laws, or they'll start changing our education. There was a study that a group of activists and myself participated in, where we started looking into the textbooks that are taught in our schools. And this was 15 years ago that we started digging into this. And we found out that there are charities that are set up to influence primarily social studies textbooks concerning Islamic history. And so they're watering things down. They're making things. They're changing our kids' opinions on things, and they're starting at the elementary school level. By the time they get to the college level, you have whole Middle East studies programs that are funded by adversarial nations, and they're coming and they're heavily influencing the faculty that they're hiring. They're heavily influencing the curriculum, and they're churning out. They're being very effective at churning out these brain dead zombies of kids that don't have a clue who our enemies are. And I think it's evident when you look at some of the studies. There was a survey that was reported by NBC that was conducted by a group called Generation Lab. After the October 7th attack, it showed 1 out of 8 American college students outright supported the Hamas attack. And that's the thing, is that they just don't know who they're supporting. They think that this whole situation started in 1948 with Israel, and that's it. If we were only a little nicer to the jihadists, and if we only didn't support Israel, that somehow they'd go away. But the reality is that out of the nearly 400, out of the over 400 interrogations that I participated in, talking to members of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, do you know how many times I heard the word Israel or Jew? 0. I never heard it once. It was always the same story of them wanting to establish this global Islamic caliphate. They all went through these Islamic schools. It was all Islamic, Islamic, Islamic. It was the religion that they were saying drives them. And the fact is that you now have these purple-haired liberals that are saying, oh, are you just some kind of Islamophobe? It's like, look, they're the ones that are saying it. In the jihadist mind, Islam doesn't play just a role. It plays the role. I can tell you in Afghanistan, the mosques were the headquarters of the Taliban. It's where they actually slept at night. And there was a leaflet that was unclassified that was being distributed all over the country that I had translated. And it translated as, this is from the Taliban to Muslims in Afghanistan. It said, being a Muslim is not only praying and fasting, it is every Muslim's personal obligation to join the jihad by providing money or yourself. So this is what they say drives them. And it's like, and how are we going to defeat our enemies if we sweep their stated drive and goals under the carpet? And so we can't be politically correct when our neck is on the line. And unfortunately, for the last several decades, we've had leadership who has just tried to crush anything that is politically incorrect. And the fact is that we've got enemies who are out there that would love to see us and our children slaughtered. and yet we're going to be like, oh, we gotta be nice with them. Yeah, no, I think it's nice we finally have somebody in Washington, in the White House, who's willing to say what needs to be said, who's blasted through the walls of political correctness, because we've got to state it. We got to get out there and show them, look, this is what the jihadists are saying drives them, and we need to listen. If that's what they say drives them, this whole book is just me telling what they say. Sarah Adams does a fantastic job getting into the weeds. I don't know how she keeps all these names straight of all the different groups that are going on there in the leadership. I take a much more macro approach to this, focusing on the mindset, because you can plug and play these leaders. When one is killed, another one steps up, and it's a new name, a new. Look how many times this Jelani has changed the group that he's affiliated with, but he's still the same guy in Syria. He was with ISIS, he was with Al Qaeda. Now he's a moderate with this HTS. It's like, yeah, give me a break. It's all the same people. They all have the same goals, but that's the thing. Is it's going to keep going. It's this 1,400-year long jihad that's just slowly been incrementally chipping away, and thankfully has been pushed back a number of times. At the Battle of Tours in 732, it was pushed back at the gates of Vienna, and now we're seeing this third jihad which is coming in. And what's unfortunate is it's more of a fifth column jihad. You have these people that are coming here, and you have them stating their goals. You had Gaddafi in Syria, or in Libya rather, had a quote where he said, we're going to conquer Europe, and we're not going to do it with bullets. We're not going to do it with swords. We're going to outbreed them. And that's the thing. It's like we look at what they're doing. They have this very long-term, slow approach, and we are like frogs being boiled in a pot.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's good. The Trump administration is making some really good moves, got some really good people that are on it from the southern border, open southern border perspective. But the war that we have to fight is much, much more than just stemming the flow across the southern border, because they're already here. Not only that, though, we found recently through the USAID scandal that our tax dollars are actually funding protesters. And one of the questions I have is, are they being used through those channels to fund the protesters here in the United States that are protesting against Israel and pro-Islamists? Because if that's the case, then you have billions and billions of dollars that are taking American kids that have been indoctrinated since grade school, as you've already mentioned, and are now in the university, which triples down on their pro-Islamism and anti-Semitism, and then they come out, or during the process, they get picked up by people like this guy. I think we're going to deport him, some student that was here on a visa that was leading one of the protests, one of the Islamists from one of the Middle Eastern countries and everything. That's good that we're deporting him, but like you said, they're all the same. Hezbollah's still around. I think Israel killed 3 or 4 of their top leadership and several layers down a couple of times during Operation Grim Beeper, and the impacts that it had, the effectiveness that it had, and those kind of things. They've killed Sinwar in Gaza, the architect of the whole thing, on October 7th, I believe, and they're still coming. They're still coming. So in this country, we've let them create a generation of American kids. They don't look like they're from Afghanistan or Saudi Arabia or Syria or Gaza. They look like you and me. That's where the real war is, and the insidious part that you talk about, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's an ideological war, and the jihadists have been very good at getting to the kids. In fact, in Afghanistan, Taliban is actually the Pashto word for students. So these are the students of the Islamic schools. And so that's why we failed for 20 years in shutting down those schools, thinking, let them have their Islamic schools and it's no problem. But the Taliban ran these schools. So they were factories for the jihadists. They operated mostly over the border in Pakistan in 2 particular cities, mostly Quetta and Peshawar. And so out of the over 400 interrogations that I participated in, every single one of them that I recall had gone through one of those schools. And so they all went through these Islamic schools. The madrasas were where they churned out the jihadists, and they continue to do so all over the world. So when you saw the newsreels of Kabul being toppled and the Taliban marching through there, most of those kids were young kids hanging on the back of these Humvees. These Taliban fighters, most of them were either toddlers or not even born when 9/11 happened. And so this is an ideological war. They're trying to get to our kids, and I mean, as horrible as the kinetic terrorist attacks are, and as nauseating as it is to think that has happened and is going to continue to happen in America, I think far worse than isolated attacks is a generation of our children turned into pro-jihadist zombies. And so we have seen it on our college campuses. And those are the voters of tomorrow. So if you have kids, get them educated on this issue. Get this book if it takes 1,000 years. Also, I would recommend if they want to go deeper, I don't get too much into the religious aspect of it because I'm just telling what they say. But there's an amazing scholar on jihad by the name of Robert Spencer. He's written about 30 books on this subject. So if you want to get in the religious aspect of it, I would highly recommend picking up some of Spencer's books.
Okay.
But it is.
You're watching Worldview 2, built on the 35 years of Worldview books, documentaries, research, high-profile interviews, and the radio and television broadcasts of Brannon House.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Slingshot TV with me, your host, Troy Smith. You know, it's just another day here at the office, but Slingshot News, you know, we're growing every day. And the idea that you guys get to participate